Welcome in. Today, we're unpacking one of the most counterintuitive, yet absolutely brilliant rules from Robert Greene's work, the fourth law of power. It's a rule that flips literally everything we've been taught about communication completely upside down. Okay, let's dive into this. So why do the most powerful people say the least? It's a huge curiosity gap, right? I mean, we've basically all been conditioned to assume that speaking up, dominating the conversation, and over-explaining everything are the ultimate ways to build authority. We think we have to show everyone exactly how smart we are. But historically and psychologically, the exact opposite is true. True power often lies in total, deliberate brevity. Section 1. The Paradox of Speech. Robert Greene argues that power is, well, it's largely a game of appearances. You're constantly projecting an image to the world. And believe it or not, your own words are the absolute easiest way to destroy that carefully crafted illusion. The core paradox here is that the sheer quantity of your speech actively reduces your perceived quality and authority. When you try to impress people with words, the more you say, the more ordinary, predictable, and frankly, vulnerable you become. Brevity concentrates your force. It makes you seem larger, deeper, a bit mysterious. Excessive speech, on the other hand, dilutes your presence and totally multiplies your chances of making a mistake you just can't take back. Section 2. The danger of oversharing. To really see what happens when you ignore this rule, we need to look at the disastrous consequences of an unleashed tongue. Check out this spectacular downfall of a Roman military hero named Coriolanus. So back in the early 5th century BCE, Coriolanus was an absolute legend. His battlefield scars and his aloof distance made him almost mythical to the Roman people. His silence essentially built an aura. But then he entered politics. Big mistake. On election day, surrounded by aristocrats, he delivered this incredibly arrogant, boastful speech. He completely mocked his opponents. And just like that, the legendary hero sounded like a common braggart. He lost the election. And it gets worse. Months later, during a green crisis, he spoke freely again, insulting the public and openly opposing democracy. The crowd's anger boiled over. They nearly threw him off a cliff. Instead, he was permanently banished. By simply opening his mouth, he revealed a deep insecurity and a lack of self-mastery that literally cost him his entire world. And hey, if you think Coriolanus had it bad, consider this darkly humorous, yet totally fatal historical footnote about Tsar Nicholas I. The Tsar was executing a Russian rebel named Kondraty Rylev, but during the hanging, the rope snapped. Now in those days, surviving an execution was often seen as a sign of divine providence, like a miracle, right? And the Tsar was actually prepared to pardon him right then and there. But Rylev just couldn't resist making a sarcastic quip. He stood up and joked that in Russia, they didn't even know how to make rope properly. Well, when the Tsar heard this, he tore up the pardon. The second hanging succeeded. Sarcasm and a momentary lack of restraint quite literally cost this man his life. Let that sink in. Section 3. The Power of Silence. Okay, so we've seen the catastrophe of the unleashed tongue. Now let's examine the masters, the people who control their tongues to project an almost terrifying aura of control. King Louis XIV of France was an absolute master of this. In his court, ministers would prepare these exhaustive, highly detailed presentations they would debate endlessly. When they finally snagged an audience with the king, they'd lay out all their options in painstaking detail. And Louis? He would just listen in complete silence. His face was an unreadable mask. At the very end of the whole shebang, he would offer just 3 vague words. I shall see. And then he'd just walk away. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the psychological engine behind the king's behavior. It's something we call informational scarcity. You see, human beings are naturally interpretation machines. We simply cannot stand an informational void. When Louis created that silent vacuum, his courtiers absolutely panicked. In their desperate effort to fill the awkward silence and guess what the king was actually thinking, they kept talking. And in doing so, they revealed their own hidden ambitions, their secret alliances, and all their weaknesses. When we compare these two extremes, the contrast is pretty stark. Speaking freely, like our friend Coriolanus, collapses your mystery. It exposes your biases and your limits. It basically screams to the world that you lack self-mastery. But remaining silent like King Louis projects tremendous depth. It proves that silence is not just emptiness, it's an active, highly tactical form of control that forces your opponents to reveal their hands first. And this isn't just a strategy for ancient Rome or French monarchs either. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the artist Andy Warhol used this exact strategy. He figured out early on that talking less gave him immense power. His interviews were famous for being vague, oracular, and just completely ambiguous. Because he never clearly explained his art, interviewers and critics frantically overinterpreted it. They projected their own deep, complex meanings onto his work, which brilliantly drove up its cultural and market value. It's genius. Section 4. Why silence works. So, we've seen the history, but how does this actually apply to your daily interactions? I mean, from salary negotiations to leadership meetings to just everyday conversations. Here are the practical benefits of holding back. Short answers immediately put others on the defensive. When you speak rarely, people spend hours pondering your few words, which massively multiplies their impact. Even if you say something totally banal, delivering it with restraint creates this aura of mystery. And most importantly, it dramatically drops your risk of saying something offensive or foolish. So the crucial point is that speaking less isn't just some grand historical strategy. It's a foundational micro-technique that supports everything else you do. Control over what leaves your mouth preserves your aura. Section 5, the strategic exceptions. Let's move to and see how this builds. Now, like any powerful rule, absolute silence isn't universally safe in every single situation. Context is everything, right? There are 3 main strategies to map out here. The primary strategy, Law 4, uses extreme brevity for control. But there's also the court jester strategy, appearing to talk freely and foolishly just to disarm suspicion, making people think you aren't a threat. And then there's the smokescreen. Sometimes highly verbose speech is actually the best way to hide manipulation. The more someone talks, the less cunning they appear. It's basically the mirror image of the silent policy, using an absolute avalanche of words to intentionally obscure your true motives. We also really have to be careful with who we are giving the silent treatment to. If you're dealing with insecure superiors, absolute silence can easily be read as arrogance, or it can arouse some really dangerous suspicion. And in high-trust, collaborative, modern work environments, excessively withholding information can severely damage your relationships. You definitely have to calibrate your restraint to your specific audience and the stakes at play. But when you are in a competitive setting, the underlying rule stands incredibly firm. Just read this brilliant quote from the Chinese legalist philosopher Han Fei Su. He says, "The longer the sovereign remains quiet, the sooner others reveal their real intentions." And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate advantage of this law. By refusing to move your own lips, you basically let your opponents do all the work. They make the mistakes, and they hand you the information. Which brings us to our final thought. We've established in this explainer that human beings are interpretation machines. We simply cannot tolerate a vacuum. So the next time you feel the urge to over-explain, to jump in and fill an awkward silence, or to boast about your accomplishments, I want you to really ask yourself, what exactly are you giving the interpretation machines to work with? Are you projecting control, or are you dismantling your own aura, one unnecessary sentence at a time? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer today, and I'll catch you in the next one.